a few questions for you.
Okay.
Hey,
Hi, so I'm Jack. I'm a third year BAS student and I'm on the social anthropology pathway. I'm here with Professor Andrew Irving. Andrew, how are you doing today?
very good. Thank you very much.
Yeah, nice to hear it. So, I just wanted to have a little chat with you about some of the inspirations that you have for your work, because I think it definitely includes a lot of academic and artistic elements. How did those passions kind of develop early in your life, and what inspirations were you taking from?
Yeah. So it's an interesting question. Where do we get inspiration from? It's hard to know, really. Um, Obviously, life and anthropology are kind of fairly intimately connected in that we already are a certain kind of social, cultural, political being already in the world before we come across anthropology. And so the kinds of people who are interested in anthropology are those that, in general, have a curiosity about the classic questions of what it means to be human. And you can't answer or address that question, what it means to be human, by looking at any one society, any one single way of being. You have to think about it comparatively. You have to compare different ways of being, which means that anthropology is essentially a comparative discipline. Because at all times you're comparing what it means to be human. And in fact, we don't even know what it means to be human. There's so many ways of being human around the world that continually changing. What's it meant to be human even 100 years ago, or even 20 years ago before social media, was something quite different from what it means to be now. And we don't know what humans will become. So for me, really, the inspiration is about a curiosity of life. It's about how we engage with the world, and whether we're open to difference and we're curious about something. And for me, that's the rationale behind why someone would study anthropology. In my case, I can think of a number of events. One perhaps is when I was about 12 years old, and we had a school trip which went around Europe. And it started off in Italy. And I thought, I'd never been out of the country before. And I thought, yes, Italy's interesting. And we went to Spain and we went to Portugal. I thought these places were interesting. And then we went to Tunisia, which is North Africa, obviously. And I was so fascinated. This is unlike anywhere I had been. Going into the souks, into the marketplaces, there was no prices. You had to barter and bargain. And I remember a lot of the kids were very frightened about how different this place was. But for me, I just loved it. It was so interesting and exciting. So at some level, I was probably already as a younger kid, younger than 12, kind of open to the idea of cultural difference. But then when you actually experienced it became something. And then, of course, you carry on at school and you do whatever you do. And in my case, I hated school. I didn't think education, British education at school level was very good. So I left school early and I went out and I worked in various things. But one of the things I did was travel the world for 3 years, working in all kinds of different jobs,
Amazing.
on ranches, whatever. And I went around Central America, Latin America, North America, Polynesia. And it was during that I really came to think about anthropology. So I remember I was in Guatemala, and I'd been working on a ranch in San Francisco, outside of San Francisco, and then I traveled down to to visit the pyramids in Tikal, which is in Guatemala. And these pyramids are, similar age in some ways to the Egyptian pyramids. And I looked around and I thought, oh yeah, it's all very interesting. And, I'd walked past these pieces of stone and stuff like that. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And up until that point, I'd always been of the opinion that it was better to experience something in order to know something than to read about it. So it's better to see a lion in the wild, to understand what a lion is, how it moves, than actually to read about it. And so I'd experienced this place, which was a Mayan society from a few thousand years ago. But then the next day, I bumped into an anthropologist who was doing their PhD,
Wow.
and they said, "Do you want me to give you a tour of these ruins?" And I said, "Yes, please." And I went round the next day, and suddenly the place came to life. So a nondescript piece of stone, I very clearly remember walking past. It was just a block of stone. They told me this is the place that every 7 years you would have a young girl who at the age of 7 was basically anointed. I don't know if that's the right way of putting it, but basically she was marked out to be a sacrifice to the gods when she was 14. So she was going to be sacrificed to the gods. They were going to say, take this life as an offering in order that you look well on our society. And she was going to be sacrificed alongside 7 prisoners, 7 criminals. And so this piece of stone was where 7 people were lined up, and then their heads were cut off. And then the blood, you could see in the stone, there was a kind of channels where the blood would collect, and then that blood would be for the land or for the gods or whatever. So suddenly this piece of stone came alive. And so I kind of changed my opinion about the best way to understand something is to experience something. Suddenly I realized, not all, not everything's available to our sensory perception. We do have to read about things. And that's where I became, kind of a decision kind of was made then, I think, that to study anthropology, because of the ways in which I suddenly realized that, there was so much knowledge behind what we could see that you could only really address through some kind of systematic study. In this case, for me, it's anthropology.
Yeah, and all that's very obvious in your work as well, to still have those elements from one of those initial interactions with anthropology, those real visual elements, and you trying to show the kind of phenomenological aspects in your work. It really still comes through to this day. And it's like, it's great to see that you can genuinely just be inspired by kind of singular moments that you can point out that can really like change your career in different directions and really inspire you to do stuff. So that's
It's
great
a
to
good
hear.
point, because life is full of contingencies, so why somebody ends up being an anthropologist and someone else becomes an accountant, all these things, we're not actually quite sure why it is. And in my case, I used to be a musician, and I remember I was playing at a little place, a pub in Islington, where I used to play regularly. And I was playing, and it was St. Patrick's night. So there's lots of people who are very drunk, and I was playing, and a guy in the front seats, as it were, in the front row tables, was so pissed he fell asleep into his, I think it was some kind of dinner, I'm not sure, but whatever it was in he just fell asleep. And I thought, I've had enough of this. It's hard to make a living playing music anyway. And then you're thinking, what am I doing it for? So the next day I said, I'm going to get a job. And so I opened the paper, and I was looking through the paper, and I saw this amazing job. And it said needed a degree in anthropology. And I thought, okay, I'm going to do, that was the kind of moment that crystallized. I'd been thinking about
Yeah.
anthropology for a while, but crystallized it into a decision. So if that guy had not fallen into his soup, I may not have ended up being an anthropologist, because I'd just carried on playing music or trying to play music and stuff like that. So the contingencies are quite interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And also from my perspective as well, I went to uni to study politics, and it kind of just
Yeah,
happened that I did anthropology with my degree, and now I'm on an anthropology pathway, and I absolutely
yeah.
like love the concepts, and like a lot of the time love the teaching as well, and feel like all the lecturers really have their own interests. And also I like that anthropology gives you the freedom to kind of move around with your direction and scope, and it's kind of, in a lot of senses, not limited to one discipline. Like I feel like a lot of anthropological papers rely on sociological and philosophical understandings as well. But I think it really brings them together in a way that's kind of targeted at culture and real deeper human meaning and connection.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting observation about anthropology as a discipline that, you know, you can engage with other disciplines. I mean, people have called anthropology, it's like history, only it's the history of the present and history of now. Or people have, like Tim Ingold, called it philosophy only with the people in it, and it asks a lot of the same questions a philosopher might ask, but does so by going out there into the world. And I think that's an essential aspect for me, is that I would find it difficult, I think, to do a discipline where I was purely restricted in terms of an academic setting. And so for me, the act of going out, let's say, so my last project was working with, you know, deaf young people in South Africa. I was working with 6 schools, teaching them filmmaking and photography. You know, that's being out there engaged in the world in a different way, I mean, than being in a university setting the whole time. So that's an aspect of anthropology I really like, is that you're constantly making links with both across different disciplines, but also you're not beyond disciplines. You're making links outside there. In this case, with 6 schools in South Africa, you know, for deaf children, was, you know, it was an interesting life experience and collaboration that we had with them.
Yeah, and also there's a suggestion that kind of visual anthropology is separate from normal anthropology in a lot of ways, like McDougall suggested that, among others. So I'd like to ask about how you think that visual anthropology can go beyond just like textual analysis, and how it could like maybe affect society or affect public policy in kind of new ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think all the different media, whether that's text or images or sound, they all have strengths and weaknesses. They all have possibilities and constraints. And anthropology continues to be a largely text-based discipline, and that has many positive aspects. But there's certain things that text can't do very well. So, for example, if I look out of my window, if I was to write down everything that I can see outside of my window, so I can see a building, I can see windows that have certain shapes, I can see some people, what they're wearing, how their hair is falling, all these kinds of things. I can, in a second, I can take a photograph of that and communicate a lot of information that it would take me a long, long time to write down. And even if I wrote it down, even if I was a fantastic writer, I probably still wouldn't be able to capture that person who's walking by in the same way as I could by filming them. So images can do certain kinds of work, or sounds can do certain kinds of work, both at the level of research and representation that text can't. A lot of society is non-linguistic. A lot of society is based in the sensory realm, in the visual realm. And so having a method and a mode of representation that's able to both research and represent that, I think is useful. I mean, in my own case, I can't remember if we looked at this in Vision Senses, but, you know, I wrote an article on suicide in East Africa called Ethnography, Art and Death. And it was in the main journal in British Anthropology, Journal of Royal Anthropological Institute. I'd imagine about 12 people read that. You know, if I went out and I said, do you want to read my ethnography of suicide in East Africa? The general public are not going to be interested in that. Other academics probably in other disciplines are probably not that interested in that. Even anthropologists, you know, they think, well, do I really want to know? They might not read that either. So if we think anthropology is important, if we think it's relevant, if we think it has something to say, by restricting ourselves in one medium of text, we are restricting our potential audience and our impact in the world. And it's not to put down text, because text is fantastic, writing's fantastic for many things, but academic text is not very good for engaging the public, an interested public that's out there that wants to know. So in this case, a former student, Josh Azuz, who took vision and senses, he was inspired by some of the classes, and he later became a theatre director. And so he got in touch and said, let's work together and make something. And so we turned these academic articles that I'd written into a play initially for Edinburgh Festival.
Wow.
And then it was also live streamed on the BBC and to cinemas. And then it was on BBC iPlayer, I think, for about 18 months. And so suddenly you've got an audience of thousands and thousands of people, as opposed to speaking to 12 people. And if I said to a member of the public, you know, do you want to come and see this play with me? Or do you want to come to the Odeon because there's this film on that I'm interested in? Or do you want to stay in and watch iPlayer? They're much more likely to be engaged with that than read a dense academic text. Mm-hmm. So we can use visual media to engage a public that is interested in these questions. Mm-hmm. And these concepts and this research, but not in the format that we disseminate it often as anthropologists, you know. So there's a very interested public out there. I think maybe in Vision Senses we spoke about how before television got deregulated, there had to be a certain amount of educational content, and straight after Coronation Street, you would have Disappearing World, an anthropological documentary made by Granada TV, Granada TV, that's where our Granada Centre of Visual Anthropology at Manchester comes from, because they were involved in setting it up. So you'd have 20 million people watching Coronation Street, watching, you know, the character, whatever's happening, Stan's having an affair with Jessica, and, you know, so-and-so's mum is in prison, etc. And then around 12 million or 9 million of those people would stay on, and then they would start learning about, you know, the social life of people in Papua New Guinea, or, you know, life in Morocco, or, you know, pastoralists in East Africa. You know, they would engage with this. So there is an interest in that out there, I think, in the public. But so one thing that visual anthropology can do is it can engage the public in a particular way. You know, so that's one of the reasons I'm interested in it, is because of its creative potential.
Yeah, and I love that about your work as well. Like, it's clearly like for a purpose, like it's accessible to people. And I feel like in a lot of ways, like even the ways that academia can be written is inaccessible even to academics, in ways that they're using words that they don't necessarily have to. And I feel like, yeah, it's unaccessible to a lot of the population. And I feel like there definitely needs to be a turn in the social sciences to trying to make things more accessible and make these ideas kind of plain and get these debates out to people. I wanted to ask about... No, carry on.
I was just going to agree with you, is that I think there's a lot of fundamental questions that people out there are asking that anthropology and anthropologists can engage with. So when you're saying about writing, I do a writing workshop, and I did one with an anthropologist called Paul Stoller, who writes on the senses. And for the start of the workshop, it's translating an academic text, in this case, Pierre Bourdieu, into accessible language. And so it's a really interesting exercise for the students to learn. How do you make Bourdieu relevant and interesting, accessible? And the thing is that, you know, you don't have to simplify things in terms of their, you know, the intellectual, the questions you're asking. So I did another project, which was, you know, really about, it's very experimental. It was on modernist literature and inner dialogue, and it was an experimental art anthropology piece. And, you know, it was it was picked up by some media outlets, and about, I think, 500,000 people watched that. It was on. It was basically trying to understand the kinds of inner dialogues that people have when they're walking around cities. So it's a very interesting question that relates to, when I walk around a city, I'm interested in knowing what this world is, what these people are thinking. Five people walking down the same street, we don't know what they're thinking. One person is, perhaps thinking about sports. The next person is thinking about what to buy for dinner tonight. The next person is obsessing about an actress they saw. The next person is walking to the hospital because they're visiting a family member who is dying. And so all that social life has to offer, from the trivial to the tragic, is there in front of us all the time, but we don't have access to it. And so this was a project in which I tried to think about this, and worked with strangers in New York. I'd mic them up and they'd speak out their thoughts. And that was quite experimental, but it engaged a big audience. 500,000 people watched that. And so again, it shows that if you can take these interesting concepts and present them in a certain way, there will be people who are interested.
Yeah, definitely. I remember listening to that project in a vision sensors and memory, and it was really interesting, some of the stuff. I mean, it's quite overwhelming when we think about, we're walking around a metropolis and everyone has their own kind of problems, and it's a very overwhelming thing to think about, people having the same level of emotion, the same intensity of things happening in their life, as us, and that is definitely a thing that can have endless anthropological work on. So bringing in film and visual mediums into that, I think, can really get under the skin of society and help people to kind of realize the complexities of human life, especially in contemporary society. I just wanted to ask you about your, so you kind of talked to me about the start of your academic career. You've now worked in a load of other places since then. You've worked in New York, you worked in Africa. How can you kind of characterize that journey in broad terms? What leads you onto these new research topics? What leads you to these new institutions?
Well, there's a couple of things. Part of it is about, what we were saying before about what kind of discipline anthropology is, because it's only partly a discipline that takes place in a university setting. And so there's a film director called Robert Altman, an American director who worked in Hollywood. And he said each film is like a life, because you get to know people, you get to fall in love, you argue, you fall out, you get back together, you have good times, you have bad times, you have crisis. And then at the end of the film, you all go your separate ways. So, you've got this 9 months of a film, and then you start another film, and it's like starting another life with another set of people. So anthropology is a bit like that. So I have, or like Katie or any other anthropologist, we have our academic life in the university, which is based around, for me, it's based around teaching, because I think that's what universities are there for. But also I have a life in Uganda, in Africa, where I've done research for over 20 years. So I have a whole life, set of friends, people I've worked with. And then I also have a life in New York, where I've also done research for a long time. So you, as an anthropologist, you do have the capacity to live all these different lives. So that's one motivation. And then my other motivation is really, it's a tactic more than a motivation that I also communicate to my PhD students about keeping a number of balls in the air. So you don't know which one's going to fall, but you throw 5 balls up in the air. So, one may be an experimental project in, Colombia that you're interested in. Another might be writing a new book. Another might be, doing a new play. Another might be working as in a collaboration with, like, say, the schools in South Africa. another might be something else. Now, all those things, it's unlikely that they're all going to happen because of funding and because of, you know, all kinds of timings, all kinds of things. But if you throw 5 up in the air, one of them will land. So in my case, the most recent one that landed was working with these schools in South Africa with deaf children, which was an amazing project. And the work that they produced, you know, we showed it in major galleries in South Africa. We showed it in New York. We were due to have an exhibition in New York, but unfortunately COVID stopped that. That was one of the balls that fell down, you know, and so that took me in the direction. I quite like that because, you know, if it was just me deciding, I think that would be less interesting than letting, at some level, the universe decide where I'm going to go next.
Yeah, it's quite a task to decide those things, and definitely playing a numbers game and trying to keep your fingers in multiple pies is a great way to do things. And I really like that idea of kind of letting the universe decide a bit more as well, because when you're a professor such as yourself and you have books written on life of death, work done in Uganda, you know, visual projects helping blind children, you kind of come to a point where, well, I'm thinking like, how has he just got to all these things? You know, they're clearly amazingly interesting, but they're not like something that you would necessarily come to yourself. So it's great to see that. And also the thing you were saying about having lives in multiple countries, that's amazing, really, and quite inspiring as well, because it kind of shows like the multiplicity of identities that we have in today's day and age, and that how kind of living in different places kind of puts part of your soul there. And also you can then go back and access that history and the cultural foundations you've laid down there. But speaking of academia, I feel like in my peer group, there's not necessarily a massive drive to go into academia. And I mean, I know people from across the social sciences spectrum, and I don't really hear anyone speaking about going into careers in university, going into careers in research. Um, do you feel that? And do you feel there's anything that we can do collectively as institutions to kind of get people to be more invested in research and look for a career in academia in the future?
I mean, I think it's a great, great privilege to work in a university setting, because basically the same things I would do in my life anyway, thinking about ideas, reading, watching films, making things, that I would do anyway, I get paid for. So kind of an ideal position. Yeah, of course, you know, like with any institution, there is, you know, you know, you've got a certain amount of bureaucracy and all these other kinds of things. But basically, it's a great privilege to be paid for a engaging with the things you're interested in. So, what I'd say in terms of if somebody's thinking about academia is that it's an amazing opportunity to really live a life and engage with the things that you're very interested in. So it would start off in anthropology, in my case, you know, would be thinking about something like an MA in visual anthropology, because what that means is that you spent 3 years learning theories and discipline of the discipline, theories of the discipline, but it's quite a passive thing. And that's perhaps why people get put off carrying on, because it's all about passive learning. Whereas for the MA in visual anthropology, but there'll be other courses that would do a similar thing, you're actively creating, you know, you're learning new skills, filmmaking, photography, sound recording, and you're producing the work. It's not as if you're simply reading about other people's work. You're actually going out there and you're making a film on whatever it is that you're interested in, you know, like in India, or, you know, Canal Street in Manchester, whatever it is that you're interested, you're producing work. So you're spending time engaging with something that you're interested in that, you know, I always say to the students at the end of Vision Senses that they are the next generation of anthropologists, and that whether they take that into an academic arena or into teaching or whatever, or you know, being an estate agent, whatever it is that they do, it's a useful way of thinking, because essentially it's about understanding human beings, especially in an increasingly complex, intensely connected, globalized world that we live in, have an understanding of social cultural difference is important. But the thing then, if you want to go further than that, why do a PhD? Well, I always say to students that are interested in a PhD is that, you know, what would you like to spend 3 or 4 years of your life doing that you've always wanted to do? You know, so what is it that you know, so even if at the end of the PhD you took the certificate of your doctorate and you ripped it up and you threw it away and you said, I'm never going to do this, I'm never not going to academia, it doesn't matter because you spent 4 years doing something you're passionate and interested in. You know, maybe thinking of some of my PhD students who've graduated, you know, you've gone and you've lived in the rainforest in Peru, and you've lived a life in Peru, or you know, you've asked a question about health and illness that's always been of, you know, of interest to you because you're committed to understanding that thing. So then at the end of the PhD, obviously you still have the option of trying to, if you want to pursue an academic career. But my advice would be, think of something that you're really interested in, that you'd like to spend 4 years doing, regardless of what happens at the end of it. And don't worry about what happens at the end of it necessarily, because, you know, that 4 years is an amazing life experience that you might not get in another context.
Yeah, I feel that's so true. I just feel like for my generation, there's so much pressure on getting a degree as a means to an end that you actually kind of lose just the love of finding knowledge, like connecting different academia and going out there and trying to just generate knowledge and generate things that other people can access to make them think about the world in new ways. And I feel like just with the commercial society as it is, like growing up, it's very hard to just let your artistic and creative direction flow and not think about, okay, I'm doing this degree to get this job, I'm doing this degree to enter into this industry. And I feel like anthropology, to be fair, is something that you can diversify from. But yeah, I feel like pursuing knowledge just for the sake of pursuing knowledge is a very beautiful thing, and that should be an inspiration to do a further study in itself.
Well, I always think it's a bit more than that, actually, because I think that what you're doing in anthropology is effectively is you're working with other people. So what you're doing is you're asking a set of questions about whatever it is, but essentially the human condition, what it means to be human. And rather than having those people as objects of study, as it were, in a kind of old-fashioned anthropology, you're you're setting an agenda with them, a set of mutually defined aims and objectives with them. So you're working with and alongside them, in which they are contributing to shaping the content and character of the research, of the outcomes. And what that means is it'll take you to places, intellectually, physically, and otherwise, that you'd never get to on your own. So you may have a question that you're interested in answering. So at the moment, my next book is about probably going to be about light. That's my idea. So how does light translate into life? Because you know, essentially light is the essence of all life, because through photosynthesis you get life and stuff like that. And yes, I could sit in a library and I could think about that question. I could come up with a set of answers, but they wouldn't be as interesting as working with people. So some of the people I've been working with, as you know from Vision Senses, I've worked with blind people. It's a very interesting question, what light means. And I met this amazing person who I started working with MND, which is the same condition that Stephen Hawking had, called Sarah Ezekiel. And so she can only communicate by moving her eyes because she's paralyzed. And how I met her was, I was writing this book on light, and I was very interested in how we give attention to the world through looking. And obviously looking is a medium that takes place in light, you know, you need it. And I started thinking, well, for whom is that important? And so I started thinking about athletes. Well, yes, of course, you know, being able to see a ball and stuff is important, but it wasn't really what I was getting at until I started looking for people for whom the act of looking was more than that. And in Sarah's case, she can only communicate really through her eye movements, and it gets communicated into a text through like a computerized voice in the way that Stephen Hawking had. But she's also been creating art through her eye movements. And so what you're doing is you're translating light into a digital form that is then becomes artwork. And I've asked her to do the cover for my next book. So I would never get to those ideas on my own.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's about forming these collaborations with people. And then that is brings so much to it. So yes, it is about knowledge, but it's also about, you know, forming relationships, because you will uncover and open up areas that you're not even able to conceive of, let alone research on your own.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that getting the subject involved with the like anthropological process or the social research process is so important. And for example, in your work in South Africa with the children doing the photos and stuff like that, it really brings such a powerful element to the work. And I feel like that is something that historically maybe anthropology hasn't done enough of. And so now I think it is necessary for contemporary anthropology and all social sciences to really get the subjects involved with the work that you're doing.
Well, there's definitely an ethics and a politics to all research,
Mm-hmm.
that we can think of as embedded within, and also a reflection of wider politics. And so I think, you know, we're no longer in an era where you have the privileged white male gaze that is telling you what's, you know, society saying these are the so-and-so people, this is how they think. The only way we can really approach anthropology is as a ethically and politically grounded activity that's
Mm-hmm.
inclusive of people, that recognizes their capacity to be their own theorists and to contribute actively to the production of anthropological knowledge. Because otherwise, all we're doing is, you know, people are essentially ventriloquist puppets. Then you know, if that kind of process doesn't take place, it's not to say, you know, it's not to say that there aren't power relationships. There are embedded in all relations,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, we have to recognize how power is embedded in all these things. But we can also think about how we can mediate some of that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Andrew, we've had an amazing chat. Thank you so much for coming on to Between Two Baths. It's really been a great conversation.
Thank you very much. Yes.